Hi, this is Brian Denzer. I'm the data manager for the Hurricane Isaac DCMP program. And I'd like to show you today how to use the export wizard in the Coordinated Assistance Network website, can.org. First of all, you should know that if you want to use the export wizard to export data from your client database, you'll need to uh, have authorized access to the export wizard tool, and you'll do that by contacting CAN administration. So let's begin. First, you'll want to log into CAN, and then you'll go to the My Tools section of the CAN website. Navigate to your region, and on the left-hand side, you'll see the link for the Client Export Wizard tool. Click that link, and you'll be taken to a page where you have a couple of options, and we're looking for the Client Registry Export Wizard. And then the wizard fires up, actually opens a new tab, and you'll see that when you are given the Client Export Wizard page, you are on step 1 of 5. You'll actually go through 5 pages to complete your Export Wizard template. We are in fact creating a template, and you can save it. So for example, you'll see that I have saved a number of reports, and my own manner of organizing saved templates is to keep them organized by CAN tab so that I know exactly what's contained in each export wizard template. So to begin, since this is a tutorial, let's call our first export template tutorial client info. Note that I can save this export but just by clicking that checkbox, and I will continue to go to the next page in the Client Export Wizard. Now in step 2 of 5, where we have an opportunity to select fields that we want to display in our report, I see that all of the fields available in the CAN user interface are exposed here on this page. So for example, up here at the top, client info is available. And by the way, just above client info is this checkbox that lies outside of this client info box. In fact, if you click that check uncheck box, it actually selects all fields on the page. I can't really see any good reason to do that. I think you want to refine your record selection a little bit better than that. And in fact, if you do that, you'll see anomalies in the records that are returned because all of the tabs in CAN are records that are related to one another in a one-to-one relationship, which is to say that each client record in client info equals one record in client intake. The only exception is contacts. Each client can have many different services and can have many different referrals. And that fact will create incredible anomalies in your records that you really don't want to deal with. And so I strongly recommend that you stay away from contacts unless you're specifically looking for services or referrals records. And I suggest that you export referrals and services as separate record sets. But that's kind of off topic, and that can be covered in a future session. So back to the top here, page 2, step 2 of 5 in the Client Export Wizard. Let's uncheck that box because we're not going to use it. Let's say that all we're really interested in is client info. If we click the box just inside the client info frame, and I'll just scroll down here so that you can see that in fact that thin little line actually closes itself here on the bottom and sort of self-contains the client info tab. So all the fields in the client info tab are actually contained in this nifty little box here. It's actually a fairly clever strategy, I would say, for CAN to have done things in this way. It leaves open a lot of possibilities as long as you sort of understand what's going on. Now, if I click that checkbox under Client Info, all of these checkboxes exposed in the Client Info tab will now be checked. And all of those fields will then end up in my Export Wizard template record set. Let's assume that that's not what I want. Let's try to be more selective. Well, I can get client caller information, and in fact, um, that's pretty much everything as well contained in the Client Info tab, so it's worth looking. But I can be a little more selective. I can check this checkbox, and you'll see that client information is not checked, but all of these checkboxes are checked. I don't often use the global sort of checkboxes. I do, however, often uh, click the same checkboxes repeatedly when I'm building a template. So for example, agency ID is a really good one to check. Probably want agency name as long as you're checking agency ID. Client ID, probably most of the time you're going to want to know a client ID. And I am very cautious about exporting first name, middle name, last name, or alias because they are identifiers. They're fairly obvious identifiers for a client. I tend to often work with client ID. Sometimes it's necessary to have first name, last name, but you know, if anything happened to the computer that I'm working on and all those records were somehow exposed, I would be liable and my agency would be liable. So I avoid those things unless they're absolutely necessary. Pre-disaster address, I often do if I'm performing mapping. I do geographic information systems work. I create maps and I often want the address. But I can decimate the address, so um, I can sort of anonymize the address in post-processing. Sometimes you do want the address, though. It's a useful way to distinguish, especially clients who have similar names from each other. Associated disasters, I almost always click associated disasters. As you know, in any disaster, in the oil spill, Gustav Ike, Katrina Rita, or Louisiana Hurricane Isaac, the associated disaster is an important way of distinguishing groups of clients from each other. And in the Hurricane Isaac DCMP, the associated disaster is an important field to have in our final record set. There may be other useful bits of information here, but you know, just for starters, that's probably a good place to begin. So let's go ahead and export this small record set. I'll click Next Step, and I'll just point out if I grab the scroll bar and cruise all the way down to the bottom of the page, you'll see that Next Step is available there. There's also a previous step if you want to go back and forth in the Client Export Wizard tool. So clicking Next Step, you'll see that we are taken to a page where we can arrange the order of columns as they appear when they're exported. I really don't use this very much. Some people, I think, find this very useful. I prefer to post-process the records once I've got them on my computer. Next step takes us to step 4 of 5 here, specifying criteria. This is a really challenging and probably the most confusing section of the CAN Client Export Wizard. Why? Well, because what you're doing here basically is building a structured query language query to extract records. And you have to sort of understand in particular what these logical connectors mean and the operators. So let's begin by selecting some criteria. And I also want to point out here that because we're looking for more than one client, we have to use a minimum of 3 criteria. And it's almost always the case that you're going to need to select 3 criteria. There are various strategies for doing this. And typically in a supervisory capacity, you may want a very wide selection of criteria. You probably want to keep your query very wide open rather than very narrow. keep in mind here that with any disaster, generally can restrict you to a region. So here in the south, we're in Region 6. In Louisiana, we're in Region 6. So all of the clients that are exposed to us in Region 6 are generally available to us here. That would be far, far too broad a category, and we wouldn't want to do that. It would first of all provide us with a lot of useless records, but it would also just bog down the system and create an enormous file that would be just not useful to us. So what we really want to do is narrow down our criteria. And that's what we're going to use these criteria for. Now, I want to point something out. I've seen various strategies for doing this, but when CAN says you must use a minimum of 3 criteria, this is probably the first mistake I made. I saw criteria group 1, criteria group 2, criteria group 3, and so on. And I thought, well, I need to type my criteria in each one of these boxes. Well, in fact, you don't. You can use the first 3 little drop-down boxes here as your 3 criteria, and that's what I recommend actually. You really shouldn't be using these other criteria unless you need to use these connectors, these logic connectors in between each of the boxes. There are very rare occasions when I can imagine you doing that, and I use them, but I've never gone beyond criteria group 2. We're working with a really simple example, so let's go ahead and choose some logical criteria. Note that I've selected associated disasters equals, keeping in mind that I'm not interested in all of these other disasters in this huge list in this drop-down box. I'm really interested in one, which is the disaster that my clients are associated with. Now, I can sort of look through this long list, or I know in fact here that I'm looking for LA Hurricane Isaac. So I'm just going to type L on my keyboard a couple of times, a few times, until I see what I'm looking for. And there it is, Louisiana Hurricane Isaac. So just clicking the L key is the fastest way to get to that. Associated disasters equals Louisiana Hurricane Isaac. So already I've taken all of those client records in Region 6 and filtered them down and limited them to Louisiana Hurricane Isaac. What can I use for my other 2 criteria? Well, I've seen some users select associated disasters equals, say, Hurricane Isaac 3 times. I have never done that actually. It's an interesting approach. I tend to use other criteria which make more sense to me. So for example, the agency ID is probably relevant. If you work within a single agency, if you're a supervisor in a single agency, you're probably interested in just your agency. You probably don't want to know all of the agencies involved in Hurricane Isaac disaster recovery. So you could choose your agency. So for example, 383183 is the Catholic Charities of New Orleans agency ID. But let's say you want a very broad criteria. Let's say you want all of the agencies associated with Hurricane Isaac. Well, a strategy that I like to use is greater than or equal to 0. That gives me all of the agencies associated with Hurricane Isaac, understanding that every agency has an agency ID greater than 0. In fact, they're all greater than 300,000. I could choose that, but 0 makes sense. What for the third criteria? Well, you could choose agency name, but you'd have a hard time finding a good operator to select your criteria. I mean, you could say, if you know the agency ID that you have, in this case it's actually HIRC Cano. You could do that, but that's not very simple. The easiest way is actually to do something like this. Just repeat what you just did. Every client that you're interested in has a client ID, right? So just choose client ID greater than or equal to 0. In fact, or just say greater than 0. Um, I'm a little meticulous about these things. I like the greater than or equal to, but there you go. So there are 3 criteria. Now you can save these if you happen to be building a really long criteria and you're afraid of losing your work or something like that. That can be a useful tool. Note that over here in the logical connectors, all of them are AND, right? There's really almost never a case where you're going to change that. If I select OR, that's really going to throw off my query for reasons that I really don't want to go into right now. It's almost always the case that you want an AND logical connector. Now I can show in a future example uh, why that might be useful, say, in a second criteria group. So this is sufficient to get some records out of the client export wizard. We're on step 4 or 5. I'll choose the next step. And here you're given an opportunity to create a sort on one of these fields. You might want to sort on, say, client ID. Again, this is something I don't often use just because I like to post-process my records, and I can sort them in that post-processing environment. If I scroll down here at the very bottom of the page, you'll see that there are save options. It's important to take a look at this and just review what you've done. You'll want to save this query. Again, we named it way at the beginning, tutorial client info. Now this is something brand new to CAN, and I think many people will find this to be very useful. You can share your template. So I can share all the work that I did in tutorial client info and all those specialized parameters and criteria that I selected. I can share that with somebody else in my agency or with all agencies. Now, in honesty, I've never used this tool. I have yet to explore it. I'm curious about all agencies, though, and I'm wondering if that means all agencies within the Hurricane Isaac disaster recovery or all agencies across the United States. So I want to be careful about this, and I haven't really tested it out. For now, I would just point out that, whatever your agency is, you can share within your agency, and that's going to be something very useful to a lot of people, I think. We're really done now, and we can begin exporting our records. We're on step 5 of 5 in the Client Export Wizard, and all we have to do now is click Export. I really never, sometimes I go back and modify something, but it's pretty much all I ever do with the Client Export Wizard. Now you'll be taken to another page where you'll see that you're given a message, the export job is waiting to run. In fact, it's processing. Give it time to run. Sometimes these things can take a minute or two, but when it's finally done, and note the page may refresh a couple of times or a few times until those records are pulled from the database and are prepared for you. In this case, I see that 2,451 records matched the search criteria that I selected. So remember, the search criteria were associated disaster, Louisiana Hurricane Isaac. I chose a client agency ID greater than or equal to 0 and a client ID greater than or equal to 0. So basically, I've chosen all of the records that are available in the Hurricane Isaac DCMP program. And I've been given a link to a file. Now, be careful about this. Browsers handle these files in different ways. You want to know where the file is going. And I'm just going to exit the website for a minute and just show you my directory structure. I keep, in any project I work on, whether it's one disaster or another or some other client that I'm working for, I very much retain the same client structure. So here's my Hurricane Isaac DCMP folder, for example. I have a data folder, and within that folder, I have raw data. In this case, I have CAN raw data, and in fact, from previous exports, for example, I have an export that I did on 5/16. I have, and actually that should be up in this folder. This is getting into the nitty-gritty of things. I also have a a May 22nd, 2013 export set of data. The one that I work with for production, like right now, is this one. So Isaac DCMP data raw can export. And I actually grab, the reason I'm showing you this is that I grab this path string, I highlight it, and I hit Control C on my keyboard. You could also go, I think, copy. But I grab that string, and then when I go back out to the website here, I'm going to right click. You can also just click. Sometimes the browser, you can left click, but sometimes the browser will send that file somewhere where you can't find it again. So I'm going to right click and choose Save Link As, and I'm going to immediately paste that path that takes me straight to this folder, this export folder. And I'm going to say save, or actually it's not going to let me save, but let me back up. Let's try this again. Save as. Here we go. So I'm going to paste my path in, and voila, here's my file. Just know that it's going to send that file somewhere that you may not understand. I'm going to either extract using an unzip tool, or in Windows you can just open this thing up and drag it out. And there's the file. Now, every single export wizard file has exactly the same name. This can be a bit hazardous, and so I often rename these right away. So this was, in fact, tutorial client info. And if I open this up with just an editor, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. We see the associated disaster, LA Hurricane Isaac. You see that there are many different agencies that have worked on this Hurricane Isaac recovery, including the American Red Cross. I scroll down here to the bottom. You'll see there are a whole bunch of new agencies like Catholic Charities, the Catholic Charities DCMP project, and still more organizations. Here's Catholic Charities of Baton Rouge, for example. So this is not a very meaningful record set. I just wanted to show you a very simple example to get the records out. Now in the future, you'll want to get very client-specific information, client-specific attributes out of the client export wizard, and that will be a topic for a future tutorial. For now, I just want to show you that if I go to my tools, back to the client export link, back to client registry export wizard, sometimes it's difficult to navigate these things. Somewhere in my list here is the new export wizard that I created, and I can edit that existing template, or I can immediately export those records in the same way. If I click that export button, it's doing the same thing. See how it's processing and it's going to export those records. This is where using the export wizard is particularly helpful. You can save the work that you've done, the detailed work that you've done before in building an export wizard template, and easily access it to get the exact same result. Of course, the records may actually change on the backside, so the criteria will apply to that new record set, but this will save you a lot of effort. Furthermore, if you can save this and share it with other members of your agency, they can use the same template and see exactly the same records that you see using the criteria that you selected. Now I'll do a more complicated export wizard template in a future tutorial, but this should be enough to get you off the ground. And I would mention that you can't really hurt the client export wizard. You want to be careful with it. You don't want to export all of the records in the universe of canned data, but you're really not going to hurt it. So the best way to learn really is just to export records, take a look at them, and play with them. And you'll see in a future tutorial as well that you can use a basic tool like Microsoft Excel to view these records. And that'll be the topic of a future tutorial again. So thanks for your attention. This training on the CAN export wizard.